I hate cults. I imagine that's an uncontroversial opinion. Maybe you know someone in one, or maybe you've watched a documentary about one. Either way, I'm sure you know the hurt they cause. But what is a cult, really? I mean, you might have some images of people in robes chanting in dark rooms, secret esoteric languages, or other, frankly, imprecise images. If we hate cults, if we say that, it's simply not enough. We have to be able to understand them, literally to grasp them, if we hope to be able to put them away. And so that's what I hope to do in the course of this speech, to help you understand cults. And so I'm going to go through two characteristics. Firstly, us non-cultists, we have a limited ability to describe reality. I mean, yes, we have science, but science is always changing, evolving, updating, never too sure of itself. And there is a specific reason I bring science into this, because that's the level we're working at, that level of claims about reality. Because we're not talking about religion in general. We're not talking about groups who voluntarily associate based on an ascension to certain propositions about how the world could be. It's not an openness, it's not a faith, it's not doctrine, it's a dogma. It's a sheer is. Just as I'm here talking and I can hear myself and I can see you all in front of me, and just as you all can hear me, and you're all listening, hopefully, just as that's the case, just as that is absolutely, certainly real, so is a cult member's dogma real to them. And so, on that basis, back into that comparison with science, once a scientific theory is challenged with contradictory evidence, it has to either revise itself, or if that evidence is overwhelming, it has to be abandoned. Not so with cults. With cults and conspiracies, things tend to grow rather than to shrink, right? So if we imagine a belief, an idea, a conspiracy as a kind of a thread or a fiber, the tendency is never to let it go. It's always to complicate it, to interweave it with another thread, to divert. And as this process continues, eventually there reaches a critical point at which this bundle of knots becomes so sheer, so thick, that no evidence could ever be sufficient, that pulling at any piece of the knot simply makes it tighter, that it forms a bubble reality, separate to how everyone else perceives the world. That's a lot of abstract stuff. How about something a little more concrete? Raise your hands here if you know who David Icke is. A few. And that's fine. I didn't know who he was either until I started researching for this speech. He was a fairly famous football commentator in the 90s, but what he later became much more well known for was something a little more insidious. He tied together this conspiratorial idea of the New World Order, aliens, Martians, all these kinds of things, with a deep undercurrent of narcissism. And while most of you, almost all of you, haven't heard of David Icke, I'm sure you've heard of those ideas. And that's because, frankly, conspiracy theorists, they're not the most original people. Their ideas can't stand a sober analysis, a scrutiny. They can't be looked at in isolation. They can only exist, they can only appear to have something in them once they're masked in in other theories, right? They cannot. And so that's why you've heard of all these other theories, even though you haven't heard of David Icke. Because David Icke isn't presenting David Icke's ideas. He's just part of this mush, this conspiracy atmosphere, this air of doubt. It's not an idea. Okay, so that's our first characteristic. That's how cults preserve themselves. That's how they maintain this kind of bubble reality, this knot within which the cult members exist. But that doesn't explain why anyone would want to join one in the first place. Surely, if it's like a bubble, then the more complex, the more messy this web of knots gets, the more incomprehensible it should be to an outsider, the more unintelligible. But it remains the case that people join them. So why is that? And here rests the real tragedy of cults. The problems they prey on are real, but the solutions aren't. I've watched countless documentaries in preparation for this speech, and there's one universal, and that's the hope that you see in their eyes, the hope that it's all real. You see, you might have this certain idea that cults are based on a charismatic leader who indoctrinates a helpless group of followers. And while that's certainly true, the reverse is also kind of true, right? Because it's the leader who needs the followers. It's the followers who need the cult to be true. Because if it's not, then they've wasted sometimes years of their lives, their social being, in a delusion. And that is a horrifying thought to come up against. And it's also why you can never debate someone out of a cult. Because essentially, you're not debating a belief in aliens, the Illuminati, anything of that nature. You're debating a person. You're debating their problems, their decisions, their addictions. And that stuff, that's as real as it gets. Okay, so that's the end. I should be going now, right? Well, I'm sorry. I have to come clean. I've lied to you, massively. I've lied to you about what this speech's intentions were. I've lied to you about what a cult is. And most pertinently, I've lied to you about what reality is. Because I've kind of presented it in a dichotomy. I've said, science says this, cults say this. But that's just not fair, right? Because we're not working on this level of reality. We're not talking about what reality is. We're talking about worldviews. As brilliant as science is, as much as it can tell us about how the world objectively is, one thing it can't do, one thing it will never do, is teach us how to navigate the seas of human meaning. Because I don't remember ever one day taking an eraser to the inside of my head, sitting down, and becoming this tabula rasa, this blank slate, and trying to figure out from first principles what I thought about the world. I never remember doing that. What I do remember is sights, senses, feelings. I remember childhood. I think my way is better. Because essentially, if I was to try and offer a definition of what a worldview is, it's not something objective. It's a lie that we tell ourselves to keep ourselves sane, right? And that can be something horrible. That can be, as in cults, a lie that's told to the believer's psyche, that coddles them, that ensures that they never have to face chaos or the unknown. Because that is the point of a worldview, to be able to wake up in the morning and know that whatever you face, it will fit into a structure, into a system. It will make sense. And so that can be put to horrible ends. And one of the most horrible ends it has been put to is in the tragedy of the Holocaust, in the delirium that the German people were able to work themselves up into to be able to justify doing the things that they did. But worldviews exist on the other side of that coin. Oop. Viktor Frankl, a Jewish psychologist interned at Auschwitz, he wrote a book, A Man's Search for Meaning, and in it he describes this shared vision, this worldview, if you would, that he and his campmates shared. A certain prophetic, almost messianic belief that there would be a light at the end of the tunnel, that everything would be okay. Was that a reasonable view, a scientific view? I don't know, but it's not something I think anyone here would want to take away from them. And it's what got them through it. And so, to bring things to an end, am I trying to justify cults? Certainly not. The harm is obvious. But if there's one takeaway that I hope you all could have, it's simply this: that our beliefs aren't scientific, they're not objective, nor should they be. They're a tool to help us interact with others. They're a tool to fit things into things, to make sense. And with that knowledge in hand, consciously, I hope we might be able to put together the beginnings. And this is certainly not something that can be achieved in a single speech. I don't intend that you all go away now and have this concrete action plan in your head. And certainly I can't explain it in the last 30 seconds of a speech. But with that in mind, I hope we can begin to craft our collective community, or a collective cult, which we might be able to call a community, one that feeds on those real problems that cults diagnose and aims to provide them real solutions, not in opposition to a wider reality, but as that wider reality. Thank you very much.